Grace, mercy, and peace to each one of you this morning. And a special thank you to everyone that texted me this morning. I think it's easy sometimes to take for granted that other people care. And when someone sends a text that says, "We're praying for you, we're thinking about you," that's always really special. I think we ought to remember Matt today, too. He's preaching at Great Trails, so our prayers can be with him as well. This morning, I'd like to turn our attention to a story, a series of stories, I guess, in the Old Testament. You can turn to 1 Samuel. I'm curious, I don't want to get really political with this, but there's a lot of mention about the irrationality of some leaders in today's world scene. Anybody off the top, who would you consider through history, Bible times and all that, as the most irrational person you can think of in leadership? Stalin, okay. Nero. Hitler, very good. Let's go back older, into the Bible times. Who was the most irrational leader you can think of in Bible times? Herod, excellent. Ahab, very good. Did I miss one? Somebody that was horrible at throwing spears. King Saul, there we go, all right. I don't want this to be depressing this morning, but I'll tell you what. That guy was a case. 1 Samuel, I don't know, I tried to whittle this down a lot. I started with the relationship between Jonathan and David, and then I'm like, what is the context of Jonathan's life? And the contrast between Jonathan and Saul was incredible. Who was Saul? What was Saul like early on? So anyhow, we're going to start way back at 1 Samuel 8. And I guess the context of this is Israel was judged by prophets and judges for hundreds of years, no king. And we're going to break into sort of the end of the judges. Samuel was a prophet and a judge, and the children of Israel had vacillated between following God and rebelling against him all through these judges and prophets. And when Samuel was old, he appointed his sons as the judges to take over for him. Anybody know what the situation was like with Samuel's sons? Good, bad? Horrible. Yeah, they were terrible. Whatever good there is about Samuel, which there is a lot, he was a horrible father. He did a really, really bad job of passing on the faith in God that he had to his children. 1 Samuel 8, verse 1. I'm going to read it in the NLT because it's a little easier reading here for me. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba, but they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Finally, all the elders of Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. It's like an intervention, right? Look, they told him, you are now old, and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. And I had to just think, you can't blame them for asking for a king, can you? I mean, what were the options? They were looking at the future of decades of being ruled by these corrupt men. And they're just like, we can't do that. We inherently dislike being led by people we do not respect or trust. So, the people realized that while they respected Samuel and all of that, he had not done a good job of passing on the love for God to his sons, and they wanted a king really bad. God told Samuel to warn them that a king would be expensive, not just in money, but he would take their personal liberty, their personal wealth, and he could easily lead them away from God. This is a warning to all of us that power often descends into tyranny. We do well to remember that the temptation to use my personal position to demand service from others for my own enjoyment is one of the strongest temptations on earth. Do we believe that? When we have an advantage, we have power, we have a position, we have something over someone else, the temptation to use that for my own selfish gratification is really, really strong. People fall for that all the time. We see it in presidents, mayors, policemen, bosses, foremen, husbands, fathers, older siblings. The list goes on and on. Anyone who has an advantage over someone else is tempted to abuse that advantage, and that problem did not start with Saul. Getting back to the Israelites, they were insistent. They still wanted a king. The pressing reason seems to be because they were being oppressed by the Philistines, who were doing cruel things to them, as we will see later. Chapter 9, there was a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, son of Bechereth, son of Aphi of the tribe of Benjamin. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Everybody knew him. Can you imagine someone that stands head and shoulders above everybody else and was gorgeous? The story goes on about how Saul went looking for his father's lost donkeys and was eventually anointed king by Samuel. He appeared to be shocked at the calling and quite humble. God even gave him a new heart. The Bible says God gave him a new heart and prophesied through him as a sign that God was with him. His beginning seemed really good. Then he even returned to his home and continued farming after the anointing and outpouring of God's Spirit on him, patiently waiting until Samuel presented him to the nation. He didn't even tell his family what had happened and what was in his future. When the time came for Samuel to introduce him to the country, he went and hid himself and needed to be searched for. The people loved and supported him, with the exception of a few critics whom Saul had the grace to ignore. And instead of immediately wielding power and establishing a bureaucracy, Saul went back to farming until a crisis requiring his leadership would come up. It sounds like a very stellar way to begin this new age of Israel being led by a king. During this time, I'm assuming it would have been very easy for people to think, this whole transition from judge to king, this isn't so bad. The crisis wasn't long in coming. In chapter 11, we read of a horrible King Nahash of Ammon, who very cruelly gouged out the right eye of all the Israelites living on his side of the Jordan River. Some people escaped, and he planned to follow those who had escaped his terror and do the same to them. They send out word through Israel, and Saul heard about it. And the Spirit of God came upon him and filled him with anger and caused everyone to be so afraid of Saul that they followed him into battle, 330,000 of them. This is a case where God actually caused Saul to be filled with anger. Right? You can put that in your philosophical boxes wherever you want, but God has a way of directing the kings, right? God gave them a great victory. Samuel gathered everyone together before the Lord for a crowning ceremony and a farewell speech as their retiring judge, including a very stern admonition about following the Lord. At this point, it may seem as though God had misjudged Saul and the wonderful leadership he could provide when he gave all of those really dire warnings about what a king would do. Things had started off so well. So let's stop to put some things in context. How old was Saul when he began to reign as king? He was a young man, 30 years old. His oldest son, Jonathan, was approximately 15. Do the math. Sounds as though that wasn't really unusual in those times. 14, 15 years old. So Jonathan was around 15 when Saul became king. It seems as though their home life was probably pretty decent. The response that Saul had when he was called and all of that, it seemed as though that was okay. Saul obviously did a really good job in choosing a wife. Because later on, when the wheels came off in Saul's life, it was very apparent that Jonathan had a lot of stability and a lot of pouring in of good quality godly influence, which he could be very thankful for. Let me get back here. Chapter 13, verse 2. And this is within the first year or two of Saul being crowned king. We still had the oppression of the Philistines. They weren't eradicated. And there was one of them that was giving him a lot of trouble. And in verse 2, Saul selected 3,000 special troops from the army of Israel and sent the rest of the men home. He took 2,000 of the chosen men with him to Michmash and the hill country of Bethel. The other 1,000 went with Saul's son Jonathan to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. So here we have a 15, 17-year-old boy who is general of 1/3 of the army of Israel. He's not with his dad. He's off in another section. And I find it incredible that Saul put his teenage son in charge of 1,000 fighting men. But from what I've read, they would start training for war and leadership and that sort of thing at the age of like 12. And I guess he had a lot of training by the time he was just a upper teenager. Obviously, what he had in spades was courage. He had initiative, and most of all, he had faith in God that was shown in the following verses. Verse 3, chapter 13, verse 3. Soon after this, Jonathan attacked and defeated the garrison of Philistines at Geba. The news spread quickly among the Philistines. This does not sound as though it was an order by Saul. They were separated. They were just kind of like watching and like, what are the Philistines going to do? And they had their band of men. It's like, what are we going to do? And you would think Saul, as the king, would have been the one to say, okay, here's the plan. Let's go deal with this. No, it was Jonathan that took his 1,000 men and attacked and defeated the garrison of the Philistines at Geba. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, Hebrews, hear this, rise up in revolt. All Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba. Anything strike you as weird about that? What did Israel hear? Who had defeated the garrison? They heard that Saul, well, you know how it is. The president gets the accolades when things go well and gets the blame when they don't. So I can sort of understand that. But I wonder if there wasn't some misinformation being put out there. They may have needed a misinformation board or something to deal with all of that. I don't know. Anyhow, it almost appears as though Saul took the credit when things went well, rather than giving them to his 15-year-old son who took the initiative, or 17 or whatever he was at the time. All right, so Saul was quick to capitalize on that victory. He says, Hebrews, hear this, rise up in revolt. All Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba, and that the Philistines now hated the Israelites more than ever. So the entire Israelite army was summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. So Jonathan did here, while he took the initiative and took the fight to the Philistines, it really poked the eye of the bear, or stirred up the hornet's nest, and the Philistines were now really ticked off. This right here is the first indication of something that's not right in this new kingdom. Jonathan was the one who went on the attack and defeated the Philistines, but Saul was quick to capitalize on that victory and rally the rest of the Israelites to rise up in revolt. He sounds to me like a politician with his finger in the wind to see which way he should go. And how did the news get around that Saul had destroyed the garrison? Sounds like Saul took the glory rather than allowing his young son to get what he deserved. Now, in case we misunderstand the odds that Saul was facing, let's jump ahead to verse 19. There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. The Philistines wouldn't allow them for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So whenever the Israelites needed to sharpen their plowshares, picks, axes, or sickles, they had to take them to a Philistine blacksmith. In verse 22, so on the day of the battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except for Saul and Jonathan. Isn't that incredible? Defenseless people, although I wouldn't want any of them running at me with a pitchfork. But they did not have your regular arms. So whatever weapons Jonathan's 1,000 men used to defeat the garrison, it wasn't conventional swords and spears. And of course, the Philistines reacted strongly to the slaughter of their garrison and gathered a super large army to crush Saul and the revolting people. They gathered 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and as many warriors as the grains of sand on the seashore. which is just a figure of speech saying it was just a pile of them. Now Samuel had told Saul to wait for him to offer a burnt sacrifice at Gilgal before going into battle. Saul waited 7 days, but was obviously not using his leadership skills to encourage his men, and they were quaking with fear, and many quickly began deserting the army. When he was down to 600 men, he thought he could wait no longer, and he performed the sacrifice himself, assuming the role of a priest. Samuel showed up just as he was finishing, and we all know the scolding that he gave the impatient and disobedient Saul. It was at this point in Saul's young kingship that Samuel informed him that God had determined that the kingdom would be taken from him and given to another whom God had already appointed. We know already that he was referring to David, but it would be quite a few years yet before Saul was to meet him. Samuel then left Saul, and the 600-man army warily watched the enemy outposts. Let's pick up the story in chapter 14, verse 1. One day Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost." But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped on the outskirts of Gibeah, around the pomegranate tree in Migron. Among Saul's men was Ahijah the priest, who was wearing the ephod, the priestly vest. Ahijah was the son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord who had served at Shiloh. Now, they used that ephod to determine what God's will was. Should they go to battle? Should they not? Should they go to the left? Should they go to the right? All of that. And they had the priest there. I don't know. Saul doesn't seem as though he was really using that or gaining any insight, because he was just sitting there watching, and Jonathan just kind of snuck out. I'm curious. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say whether he tried to talk his dad into doing something before that, whether he knew that Saul would not allow him to go. Anyhow, there are some people that believe that Saul was quite protective of Jonathan, did not want him to fall into battle, didn't want him to do anything risky, which may have been an explanation later why Jonathan was not involved in the skirmish with Goliath. That's assuming a lot, I suppose. Anyhow, no one realized that Jonathan had left the Israelite camp. Verse 4, to reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Seneh. The cliff on the north was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. And I think, if I remember right, one of these, Bozez maybe, meant slippery, and the other one meant very sharp. So, doesn't sound like an easy climb. Let's see, where am I here? Verse 6, let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor-bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle, whether he has many warriors or only a few. What an absolute, what a testimony of his faith. And I thought about that with the devotional that you had. That's exactly right. He was convinced God was able to do whatever he wanted to do. His armor-bearer says, do what you think is best. I am with you completely, whatever you decide. All right then, Jonathan told him, we will cross over and let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are, or we'll kill you, then we'll stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. He had not gotten a word from the Lord saying, this is what you're supposed to do. Sometimes God did that. Sometimes the people of God need to move forward and check to see where God leads. And I think that's exactly what he did here. It's a whole lot easier for God to direct a moving object than to try to get us off of our laurels, right? Just a thought. When the Philistines saw them coming, verse 11, they shouted, look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Then the men from the outpost shouted to Jonathan, come on up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Come on, climb right up behind me, Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. This was their sign. This is what they were looking for. And he went with confidence. I don't think he had any thoughts in his mind that he could be defeated. He knew that God was on his side because of the sign. Verse 13, so they climbed up using both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed those who came behind them. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about half an acre. Suddenly, panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outposts and raiding parties. And just then, an earthquake struck, and everyone was terrified. So we see here that young Jonathan was a more inspiring, self-motivated leader than his father. His declaration of faith in God's ability to save, just as easily by few as by many, inspires us to this day. But it was only after Jonathan and his brave armor-bearer killed the first 20 men that the confusion and panic took over the rest of the enemy army. And then God topped it off with an earthquake. And what a difference it can make to fearful men when boldness and faith are put into action. So, verse 16, Saul's lookouts in Gibeah of Benjamin saw a strange sight. The vast army of the Philistines began to melt away in every direction. Call the roll and find out who's missing, Saul ordered. And when they checked, they found that Jonathan and his armor-bearer were gone. Then Saul shouted to Ahijah, bring the ephod here. He's like, now what do? We need to hear from the Lord. For at that time, Ahijah was wearing the ephod in front of the Israelites. But while Saul was talking to the priest, the confusion in the Philistine camp grew louder and louder. So Saul said to the priest, never mind, let's get going. Then Saul and all his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere. Even the Hebrews who had previously deserted and gone over to the Philistine army revolted and joined in with Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of the Israelites. Likewise, the men of Israel who were hiding in the hill country of Ephraim joined the chase when they saw the Philistines running away. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Beth-aven. Although the Bible doesn't say it, I can picture the Israeli men picking up the swords and spears of the fallen Philistines as they chased the retreating enemy and continued to kill them as they went. But once again, isn't this a really embarrassing lack of leadership on display? Saul seemed to be leading from behind. What was he doing, camped by a tree? How long would have he remained there if Jonathan had not stepped up? Does it remind you of his posture about 25 years later when Goliath was taunting them and young David stepped up? Saul's lack of decisiveness and leadership was a problem throughout his 42-year reign. He spent most of his time reacting, and a lot of people suffered because of it. The next section is regarding Saul's foolish oath. And you just have to remember, Jonathan was living through all of this, right? It just highlights Jonathan's character to see them going through this blunder after blunder after blunder. Verse 24. Now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion that day because Saul had placed them under an oath, saying, let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have had full revenge on my enemies. No one ate anything all day, even though they had all found honeycomb on the ground in the forest. They didn't dare touch the honey because they all feared the oath they had taken. But Jonathan had not heard his father's command. He'd been out there fighting, right? He's the one that started it. He didn't hear the command or the oath, and he dipped the end of his stick into a piece of honeycomb and ate the honey. After he had eaten it, he felt refreshed. But one of the men saw him and said, your father made the army take a strict oath that anyone who eats food today will be cursed. That is why everyone is weary and faint. My father has made trouble for us all, Jonathan exclaimed. A command like that only hurts us. See how refreshed I am now that I have eaten this little bit of honey? If the men had been allowed to eat freely from the food they found among our enemies, think how many more Philistines we could have killed. Blood sugar levels, right? This decision of Saul's as a military commander baffles me. Maybe Saul felt that the men would lose the advantage they had as the enemy was fleeing if they paused to eat. But as the day wore on, he certainly had to see that everyone was losing strength. I think it was likely his pride that didn't allow him to revoke his order and allow the men to catch a bite to eat on the run. So verse 31, they chased and killed the Philistines all day from Michmash to Ajalon, growing more and more faint. Now you remember that the order was that no one was to eat until evening, right? What do you think happened when evening fell? That evening, they rushed for the battle plunder and butchered the sheep, goats, cattle, and calves, but they ate them without draining the blood. Someone reported to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that still has blood in it. That is very wrong, Saul said. Find a large stone and roll it over here. Then go out among the troops and tell them, bring the cattle, sheep, and goats here to me, kill them here, and drain the blood before you eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with the blood still in it. Seems like selective outrage or selective conviction. I don't know, straining at a gnat, swallowing a camel. Yeah, it's a little discombobulating to read, but because they were so famished, they became careless about the commandment God had given his people, forbidding them to eat meat without first draining the blood from it. We are seeing the result of a proud leader making his people vulnerable to temptation and sin. So that night, all the troops brought their animals and slaughtered them there. Verse 35, then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first of the altars he built to the Lord. Then Saul said, let's chase the Philistines all night and plunder them until sunrise. Let's destroy every last one of them. His men replied, we'll do whatever you think is best. But the priest said, let's ask God first. So Saul asked God, should we go after the Philistines? Will you help us defeat them? But God didn't reply. Then Saul said to the leaders, something's wrong. I want all my army commanders to come here. We must find out what sin was committed today. I vow by the name of the Lord who rescued Israel that the sinner will surely die, even if it's my own son Jonathan. But no one would tell him what the trouble was. The story goes on. I'll skip down over a bunch of it here, but they cast lots, and Saul discovered that Jonathan was the one who had eaten a bit of honey before he heard the oath his father had unwisely made. Saul rashly pronounced a death penalty on his own son rather than admit that he had been unwise. We can tell that Saul had begun to lose the respect of both his son and the men in the army. The rest of the men understood how unfair it all was and stood up to Saul and rescued Jonathan from his own father. Verse 46, then Saul called back the army from chasing the Philistines, and the Philistines returned home. So somehow I imagine Saul struggled with feeling like a failure after being stood up to. We didn't take the time to read all of that, but the men did not allow Saul to kill Jonathan. They just said that this just isn't right. They didn't do a coup. They didn't remove Saul from power, but they all just stood up and said no. I don't know what that would do to someone like Saul, but I can only imagine that had to be something that really rankled with him. And he realized that his authority and his what he could do had limits. And that probably made him feel somewhat insecure, I'm guessing. In spite of his own securities, God used him during the rest of his reign to make war on the Philistines and keep his people from being destroyed or enslaved. And after this, we read the story of Saul being instructed to totally destroy the Amalekites. He defeated them in battle, but saved King Agag and the best of the animals and goods. Once again, I have to wonder, where was Jonathan during this time? From what we've seen of Jonathan, I would guess that he wasn't too happy with that decision, but don't know. The results of this disobedience surface again many generations later. Anybody know who the descendant was of King Agag? It's all right, I wouldn't have known. Haman, in the book of Esther, was a descendant of Agag. If Saul had done what he was supposed to do here, we would never have had the almost Holocaust of the Jews in Esther. Interesting tidbit. God, obviously, in that case, used Mordecai and Esther to thwart this Agagite's evil desires and plans. And we have the beautiful story of Esther. David was born about 10 years into Saul's reign. And chapter 16 tells the story of Samuel anointing him king while he was still a shepherd boy. Sometime after that, the Lord sent a troubling spirit that tormented Saul with depression and fear. David was known as a talented musician and was brought to the palace to soothe King Saul when he was troubled. He served Saul so well that Saul grew to love him and eventually made him his armor bearer. He played music whenever needed. Then we have the account right after that of Goliath. That account suggests that David was currently back home, sent by his father to his brothers in the army. The chronological order of this is somewhat confusing, and I don't know what happened when, because Saul did not seem to know who David was when he was called as a musician. Saul also did not seem to know who David was, or at least who his father was, when he killed Goliath. So either he had a really bad memory, or there's something in there that maybe it was his split personality that was kind of flipping. I don't know. Anyhow, we know the story, the beautiful story of David and Goliath, and how David stepped up to take on and kill Goliath in the name of the Lord. Saul once again had been lingering in the camp and not inspiring courage in his men. And I have to wonder again, where was Jonathan during this period? David is estimated to have been approximately 15 when he killed Goliath, and Jonathan, by this time, was in his low 40s. In chapter 18, we read of the two meeting directly after the killing of Goliath. Chapter 18, after David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. So regardless what the chronology was here, it's obvious that when Jonathan and David met after Goliath's slaying, they both found a kindred spirit. I think it probably had a lot to do with David's proclamation of trust in God before he killed Goliath, which certainly echoed what Jonathan had said some 25 years earlier when he was about David's age now. Had Jonathan lost some of his earlier enthusiasm after years of being around Saul and his attitude? Did it take David coming on the scene to reignite his passion and sense of his place in God's army? I don't know. But he was next in line to be king. And he gave more than his tunic, sword, bow, and belt when he swapped clothes with David. I believe it was at this time that he recognized that he would never be the king and that David someday would. That was really remarkable. He took off all of those things that were a sign of his position and his future and all of that, and gave them to David. Did he take David's clothes and put them on and look like a shepherd boy? I don't know. Maybe, he probably had extra clothes that he put something else on. Don't know. The evil spirit continued to torment Saul, and he made several attempts on David's life. One was while David was playing music, and Saul threw his spear at David. Later, Saul offered his daughter to David in marriage if he could kill 100 Philistines within a short period of time, hoping David would be killed in the attempt. David killed 200 and was given his bride, Michal, much to Saul's chagrin. This made Jonathan his brother-in-law, and of course, Saul's son-in-law. That didn't keep Saul from continuing to try to kill David. So in chapter 19, Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told David what his father was planning. Tomorrow morning, he warned him, you must find a hiding place out in the fields. I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you. Then I'll tell you everything I can find out. The next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. The king must not sin against his servant David, Jonathan said. He's never done anything to harm you. He's always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought a great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There's no reason for it at all. So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. Afterward, Jonathan called David and told him what had happened. Then he brought David to Saul, and Saul served in the court as before. This was a case where Jonathan, I don't know if he was living in denial or if he just felt as though there was some kind of misunderstanding or something, but he wanted to do everything he could to reconcile these two. And it appears as though he did. It was a very risky thing to do on Jonathan's part, interceding for David, especially given the unhinged nature of King Saul by now. All through his life, we read nothing of Jonathan scheming ill for his father. Many a son in line to be king would have reasoned that it was time to bump off the king for the good of the country, but it doesn't seem to be even a thought for Jonathan. That makes me think that he must have had quite a mother. In fact, marrying her was probably the most intelligent thing Saul did in his entire life. What a mama Jonathan must have had, raising him to become the loyal, brave son he was. But now he was needing to make tough decisions between love and loyalty to his father and saving the life of his friend David. He made those choices and did it all without harming or instigating rebellion against Saul. So now for a bit, it seems as though everything is fine. It's finally taken care of, and everyone can live happily from here on out, but that's not the end of the book. 2 verses later, Saul again tries to pin David to the wall with his spear in a fit of rage, and David flees for his life. By now it's apparent that either Saul was not a great aim with his spear, or David was getting great at dodging. He ran home to Michal, but Saul sent assassins to take him out in the morning, and Michal had to be very creative to help him escape from their room, and she placed a dummy in his bed to trick them and buy David some time. It's a humorous story to read now, but I'm sure it wasn't a bit funny to David and Michal at the time. David then fled to Ramah and lived with Samuel until Saul caught up with him again. Another humorous story of soldiers not being able to capture David because as they came, the Spirit of God fell upon them. They started prophesying. They couldn't help themselves. And then he sent more, and they started prophesying. They couldn't help it. Another band came. Finally, Saul went himself, and he fell into prophesying and couldn't even take David. So God protected David, and eventually David fled back to Jonathan in chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 1, David now fled from Noath in Ramah and found Jonathan. "What have I done?" he exclaimed. "What is my crime? How have I offended your father that he is so determined to kill me?" "Oh, that's not true," Jonathan protested. "You're not going to die. He always tells me everything he's going to do, even the little things. I know my father wouldn't hide something like this from me. It just isn't so." He had been successful in interceding for David before, right? And somehow I think he was in, in denial. And just saying, I can't believe Saul actually would go through with it. I don't know what he was thinking the javelin in the wall was all about, but anyhow, "Tell me what I can do to help you," Jonathan exclaimed. Oh, wait a minute, I skipped a verse here. Verse 3, "Then David took an oath before Jonathan and said, 'Your father knows perfectly well about our friendship, so he has said to himself, I won't tell Jonathan. Why should I hurt him? But I swear to you that I am only a step away from death. I swear it by the Lord and by your own soul.' 'Well, tell me what I can do to help you,' Jonathan exclaimed. David replied, 'Tomorrow we celebrate the new moon festival. I've always eaten with the king on this occasion, but tomorrow I'll hide in the field and stay there until evening of the third day. If your father asks where I am, tell him I ask permission to go home to Bethlehem for an annual family sacrifice. If he says fine, you'll know all is well.' In that case, Jonathan's hopes would be realized. But if he is angry and loses his temper, you will know he is determined to kill me. Show me this loyalty as my sworn friend, for we made a solemn pact before the Lord. Or kill me yourself if I have sinned against your father. But please don't betray me to him." "Never," Jonathan exclaimed. "You know that if I had the slightest notion my father was planning to kill you, I would tell you at once." Verse 10, "Then David said, 'How will I know whether or not your father is angry?' 'Come out in the field with me,' Jonathan replied, and they went out there together. Then Jonathan told David, 'I promise by the Lord, the God of Israel, that by this time tomorrow or the next day at the latest, I will talk to my father and let you know at once how he feels about you. If he speaks favorably about you, I will let you know. But if he is angry and wants you killed, may the Lord strike me and even kill me if I don't warn you so you can escape and live. May the Lord be with you as he used to be with my father.'" What a statement. That was Jonathan acknowledging God was no longer with his father Saul. Somehow, even though he was still somewhat in denial and holding out hope that maybe this was just a misunderstanding, he recognized that God was really with David, just like he had been with Saul at the beginning. "And may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth." He recognized that the longevity was with David, not with the family of Saul. And he said, "When I die, make sure you take care of my family. We're friends." So Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, "May the Lord destroy all your enemies." And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again, for Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Verse 18, "Then Jonathan said, 'Tomorrow we celebrate the new moon festival. You will be missed when your place at the table is empty. The day after tomorrow toward evening, go to the place where you hid before and wait there by the stone pile. I will come out and shoot 3 arrows to the side of the stone pile as though I were shooting at a target. Then I will send a boy to bring the arrows back. If you hear me tell him, 'They're on this side,' then you know, as surely as the Lord lives, that all is well and there's no trouble. But if I tell him, 'Go farther, the arrows are still ahead of you,' then it will mean that you must leave immediately. For the Lord is sending you away, and may the Lord make us keep our promises to each other, for he has witnessed them." So David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon festivals began, the king sat down to eat. He sat at his usual place against the wall, with Jonathan sitting opposite him and Abner beside him. But David's place was empty. Saul didn't say anything about it that day, for he said to himself, something must have made David ceremonially unclean. But when David's place was empty again the next day, Saul asked Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse been here for the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan replied, David earnestly asked me if he could go to Bethlehem. He said, please let me go, for we're having a family sacrifice. My brother demanded that I be there, so please let me get away to see my brothers. That's why he isn't here at the king's table. Verse 30, Saul boiled with rage at Jonathan. You stupid son of a whore, he swore at him. Do you think I don't know that you want him to be a king in your place, shaming himself and your mother? As long as that son of Jesse is alive, you'll never be king. Now go and get him so I can kill him. Now the mask was off. Jonathan could no longer live in denial. Saul was just clean out of his gourd. Jonathan left the table in but why should he be put to death? Jonathan asked his father. What has he done? Then Saul hurled his spear at Jonathan, intending to kill him. So at last Jonathan realized that his father was really determined to kill David. Jonathan left the table in fierce anger and refused to eat on that second day of the festival, for he was crushed by his father's shameful behavior toward David. The next morning, as agreed, Jonathan went out into the field and took a young boy with him to gather his arrows. Start running, he told the boy, so you can find the arrows as I shoot them. So the boy ran, and Jonathan shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy had almost reached the arrow, Jonathan shouted, the arrow is still ahead of you. Hurry, hurry, don't wait. So the boy quickly gathered up the arrows and ran back to his master. He, of course, suspected nothing. Only Jonathan and David understood the signal. Then Jonathan gave his bow and arrows to the boy and told him to take them back to town. This all appears to be code, just in case anybody had been watching. Would have been a cover. Obviously, they were convinced nobody was, because as soon as the boy was gone, David came out from where he had been hiding near the stone pile. Then David bowed 3 times to Jonathan with his face to the ground. Both of them were in tears as they embraced each other and said goodbye, especially David. At last Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we have sworn loyalty to each other in the Lord's name. The Lord is the witness of a bond between us and our children forever. Then David left, and Jonathan returned to the town. Isn't it sad to read how Jonathan wanted to believe so badly that what seems apparent to us now was not really the case? He didn't want to believe that Saul really wanted to kill David. I don't understand how this many attempts could have been made on the man's life before Jonathan was convinced, but it seems like it was a very difficult thing for him to accept as reality and something that he could not change. So he finally gave up trying intercession and helped David escape for good. Once again, he must have struggled with the feeling that he was betraying his father a bit, but his love for David helped him to make the right choices, difficult though they were. Several chapters and many stories of Saul chasing David later, we find David hiding at Horesh in chapter 23, verse 15. One day near Horesh, David received the news that Saul was on the way to Ziph to search for him and kill him. Jonathan went to find David and encouraged him to stay strong in his faith in God. Don't be afraid, Jonathan reassured him. My father will never find you. You are going to be the king of Israel, and I will be next to you, as my father Saul is well aware. So the two of them renewed their solemn pact before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home, while David stayed at Horesh. Now, Jonathan's expectation here of how he was going to be, an advisor to David didn't actually hold out. But in his mind, it was not he would die and David would take his place. He was very fine with being second fiddle and letting David take the throne. That is incredible. Once again, I have many questions about how involved Jonathan was in trying to protect David during this time. The time when David cut off Saul's robe, when he took the spear and the pitcher and all that, and all the times when he was fleeing. Where was Jonathan? Was he in the camp with Saul? Was he at home? I have no idea. It doesn't mention Jonathan during all of those times. It does not say whether there was any instances where Jonathan misled his father as to where David was. We don't know. But his love for David is very obvious as he makes this risky trip out to find and encourage him. If you read the Psalms that David wrote while he was running, the amount of melancholy and yet faithful, or faith in God to take care of him, it's just all woven. It's just back and forth. It's like a roller coaster. He's like, why is everybody succeeding? Why are the faithful, not being exalted? Why are we running for our lives? And Lord, where are you? I don't know whether Jonathan ever got to read any of those things that David had written or heard the songs that were sung. But somehow I think intuitively he knew that a man can't be out there running for his life like that for a long period of time without struggling with depression and all of that. And he went out physically to encourage him. His belief that David one day would be king and Jonathan would be privileged to be his trusted advisor speaks volumes about his complete lack of jealousy of David. That is the last sweet moment of devotion mentioned in the Bible before Jonathan was killed in battle along with his two brothers and Saul. When David heard the news, he was devastated and wrote a beautiful song memorializing his faithful friend. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 17, it says, "Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jasher. Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no fruitful fields producing offerings of grain, for there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. They shed the blood of their enemies and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. O women of Israel, weep for Saul, for he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing, in garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you, and your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead." In conclusion, I just have to say Jonathan was a remarkable fellow. David could not have asked for a more trustworthy friend. Jonathan followed God with determination, despite his father's weaknesses and failures. He saw his father's inconsistencies and still did not turn bitter. He was a most faithful friend. He did not give in to jealousy in spite of losing the crown. He put his life on the line for his friend. He blessed this friend, David, who brought such drama and danger into his life and the life of his family. As a result, David showed exceptional kindness to his crippled son many years later. You remember the story of Mephibosheth and how he was just a 5-year-old boy and his nurse picked him up to run away from danger and dropped him and broke his legs, and they didn't have today's medicine. Instead of setting everything and him being fine again, he was lame for the rest of his life, a cripple. Instead of David taking vengeance against all of Saul's posterity, David looked at Mephibosheth as someone who he could pour mercy and love into for the sake of Jonathan. It was a way that he was able to honor the commitment that he made to Jonathan way back. I don't know what all goes through your mind in this really big story. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of stories all rolled into one, and probably any one of these chapters could be turned into a series of sermons. But just the whole picture of Jonathan, who he was in spite of who he was around, the choices he made, the friends he kept, and the incredible faith in God. It's no wonder to me that with the proclamation that David made and the proclamation that Jonathan made, when they met each other, it was just like they were soulmates. Incredible. Are we professing that kind of faith in God, that other people who are full of faith in God feel a connection with us? Or are we being quiet And other people looking on have to kind of assume what we maybe think. Are we being the kind of friend that just encourages and is there for the next person who is also professing their faith in God, or is maybe going through a tough time, maybe is being really hounded by the devil? Are we being there as a friend? There are so many things to be taken from that, and we are plumb out of time. I hope that this story of Jonathan, which was much bigger than I thought it would be when I started it, is encouraging to us, and it can be something that we take home and aspire to be at least as much like that as we can through the grace of God.